What Lisa Marie Presley saw before Elvis died, the truth was never meant to be public. She was 9 years old, and on the morning of August 16, 1977, before anyone in that house knew what was about to happen, before the ambulance, before the crowds outside the gates, before the entire world stopped, a little girl named Lisa Marie Presley woke up in her bedroom at Graceland with a feeling she couldn't explain. Something was wrong. Not "I had a bad dream" wrong. Not "I miss my dad" wrong. She woke up knowing. And within a few hours, she would become one of the last people to see Elvis Presley, the most famous man on the planet, before he was gone. For decades, Lisa Marie barely spoke about that day. Not to reporters, not to biographers, not even to most of her own family. What she saw in that bathroom, what she heard, what she felt walking through Graceland as a 9-year-old, she kept almost all of it locked away. It only came out years later in fragments in interviews, and finally, in her own words, in a memoir she didn't even live to finish. So today we're going to walk through what actually happened that morning, not the tabloid version, not the conspiracy version, but what Lisa Marie herself eventually revealed about the last hours of her father's life, and why she carried it in silence for almost her entire adult life. Some of it is going to surprise you. Some of it is heartbreaking. And by the end, you'll understand why she once said that day never really left her. It just changed shape. Before we get into it, if you're into stories like this, real history, told the way it actually happened, without the sensationalism, hit subscribe now, because there's a lot more where this came from and you don't want to miss the next one. Let's set the scene because context matters here. By the summer of 1977, Elvis Presley was 42 years old, and he was not the man most of the world still pictured when they thought of Elvis. The lean, hip-shaking kid from Tupelo who'd terrified parents and delighted teenagers in the 1950s, that Elvis was a memory. The Elvis of 1977 was tired. He was overweight. He was struggling with prescription medication, insomnia, and the crushing weight of being Elvis Presley 24 hours a day, every single day for over 20 years. He was also, by every account from the people closest to him, still deeply devoted to one person above everyone else, his daughter, Lisa Marie. Lisa Marie was the only child of Elvis and Priscilla Presley. Her parents had divorced back in 1973, and by 1977 she was splitting her life between two very different worlds, a relatively normal childhood with her mother in California, and summers at Graceland with her father, where normal didn't really exist. At Graceland, she had her own room. She had the run of the property. She rode go-karts down the driveway. She had a father who, whatever else was going on in his life, made her feel like the most important person in the world when she was in the room with him. That August, she was staying at Graceland for the summer, like she did most years. Elvis was preparing to leave on tour. He was scheduled to fly out that very night, August 16th, to kick off a new run of shows. The house was in its usual state of organized chaos. Staff coming and going, security around the gates, the strange rhythm of a home that also functioned as the command center for one of the biggest entertainment operations in the world. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, a 9-year-old girl was sleeping just down the hall from her father. Worth pausing on what Graceland actually was day to day, because it wasn't just a mansion, it was a small, self-contained world. There was staff living and working on the property around the clock. There was security at the gate managing a constant trickle of fans who showed up just hopping for a glimpse of the house. There was the Memphis Mafia, Elvis's tight inner circle of friends, bodyguards, and aides, moving through the halls at all hours. For an adult, that environment could feel suffocating. For a child, especially one who split her year between that world and a far more ordinary life in California with her mother, it must have felt like stepping into two completely different realities every few months. By most accounts from people who were around them, Elvis doted on Lisa Marie whenever she was there. He'd wake her up in the middle of the night to go get ice cream. He'd let her ride in golf carts around the property. He gave her a level of access and affection that, for a few weeks each summer, made Graceland feel less like a monument to fame and more like just home. Whatever else was happening in his life, and by 1977, a great deal was happening. The people closest to him consistently described his relationship with his daughter as one of the few things that stayed uncomplicated. That's the emotional backdrop you need to hold on to as we get into what happened next, because it's what makes the events of August 16th so devastating. This wasn't a distant, formal relationship between a famous father and a daughter who barely knew him. This was a 9-year-old girl who adored her dad, staying in his house, during what should have been just another ordinary summer week before he left for tour. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary week, everything changed. What almost nobody outside the family knew for decades is that Lisa Marie didn't just find out later that something had happened. She was there, awake, in the house, and according to what she would eventually share, she sensed it before anyone told her a single word. Here's where the story gets genuinely eerie, and it's not tabloid speculation. It's something Lisa Marie's own daughter, Riley Keough, later confirmed in a television interview with Oprah Winfrey. According to Riley, her mother woke up that morning at Graceland with an unmistakable sense that something was off. Not a specific thought, not a memory of a bad dream, just a feeling, the kind that settles into your chest before your brain has caught up with what your body already knows. Lisa Marie was 9. She didn't have the language yet to describe a feeling like that, and honestly, most adults wouldn't either. But according to her family, she carried that memory for the rest of her life. The strange, specific certainty that the day was already wrong before anyone had said a word to her. Now skeptics might say, of course she remembers feeling like something was wrong. She was a little girl whose father died that day. Of course the memory gets colored by what came after. And that's a fair point. Memory is a strange thing, especially when it's attached to trauma. But whether it was a genuine premonition or the mind's way of making sense of tragedy after the fact, the feeling was real to her, and it shaped how she talked or didn't talk about that day for the rest of her life. What we do know from multiple sources close to the family is what happened next. Elvis had gone to bed in the early hours of the morning after a long night. He'd reportedly played racquetball at the courts on the Graceland property before dawn, then retired to his bedroom suite sometime after. His fiancée at the time, Ginger Alden, was there with him. The household was quiet. Lisa Marie was in her own room. It's a strange thing to think about, that in those early morning hours, while most of the house slept, Elvis was still up, still moving through his usual restless routine of insomnia and late-night activity that had become normal for him by that point in his life. He wasn't a young man burning the candle at both ends for fun anymore. Friends and biographers have described a man who was exhausted, who struggled to sleep without medication, and who was under enormous pressure to get back on the road for a tour he didn't necessarily have the physical stamina for anymore. None of that was visible to a 9-year-old, of course. To Lisa Marie, it was just her dad in his house, the night before she'd see him off on another tour like she had many times before. And at some point that afternoon, not the crack of dawn, but hours later in the early afternoon, the house went from quiet to chaos in what felt like seconds. If you think about the layout of that day, it's almost unbearable in hindsight. A father up all night, restless and unwell in ways nobody fully understood yet. A daughter asleep just down the hall, waking up hours later already unsettled for reasons she couldn't explain. And a household of staff and family going about a fairly ordinary late summer morning, with absolutely no idea that within a few hours, all of their lives would be permanently divided into before and after. This is the part of the story that Lisa Marie kept closest to her chest for almost her entire life. It didn't fully come out until her memoir, From Here to the Great Unknown, was published after her death in 2023, finished by Riley Keough using her mother's own writing and recordings. According to what she wrote, Lisa Marie woke up that afternoon already carrying that unsettled feeling from the morning, and then things started happening fast. She ran toward her father's room. She made her way to the bathroom area of his suite, and that's where she saw him. He was face down on the floor. She has described running toward him, desperate to get to him, and being physically held back by an adult in the house before she could reach her father's side. People were already working on him, trying to help, trying to revive him, and in the chaos, a terrified 9-year-old girl was screaming, trying to push past the adults around her, understanding on some level that whatever was happening in that room was very, very bad. She has said she knew in that moment that something was deeply wrong, not because anyone explained it to her, but because of the sheer panic in the room, the sound of grown adults in genuine crisis, and eventually the sound of her own grandfather, Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, breaking down in tears somewhere in the house. Think about that for a second. This is a 9-year-old child. She wasn't shielded from this. She wasn't kept in another wing of the house and told a gentle, softened version of events after the fact by a caring adult sitting her down on a couch. She was there in the moment, trying to physically get to her father while paramedics and staff tried to save his life. That's the part of this story that almost never made it into the public conversation about Elvis's death. For decades, the narrative was about the ambulance ride to Baptist Memorial Hospital, the official announcement, the crowds gathering outside the gates of Graceland within hours, the global outpouring of grief. All of that is true, and all of that happened. But underneath the headlines, there was a little girl in that house who watched it unfold in real time, and who was carrying that image with her for the rest of her life. Try to picture the practical reality of that scene for a second. This wasn't a hospital room with trained staff quietly managing a family's grief. This was a private home, suddenly filled with paramedics trying to perform emergency resuscitation on the floor of a bathroom, while a household of aides, security, and family members scrambled in a state of total panic. In the middle of that scene was a 9-year-old who had run toward the one person in the world she trusted most, only to be pulled back by adults who, in that moment, weren't thinking about how to protect a child's psyche. They were thinking about trying to save a man's life. That's not a criticism of anyone in that house. It's just the reality of what emergencies actually look like, stripped of any Hollywood polish. Chaotic, loud, and almost impossible to shield a child from once it's already happening around her. She would later say that this day never fully left her. It changed forms over the decades, sometimes grief, sometimes anger, sometimes just a strange fog whenever August rolled around, but it never disappeared entirely. And that detail alone tells you something important about how trauma actually works in real people's lives. It's rarely a single wound that heals and closes. More often, it's something that gets carried forward, quietly reshaping itself around every major milestone that follows: birthdays, holidays, her own children being born, and eventually her own son's death decades later, which by her own account reopened almost every layer of grief she'd ever experienced, including the earliest one. Quick pause here. If you're finding this as fascinating and heartbreaking as I do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who'd want to hear this story, and it costs you nothing. Okay, let's keep going, because what happened after that day might be even more important than the day itself. Here's something that gets lost in the mythology of Elvis Presley's death. The world grieved him as a global icon, but Lisa Marie had to grieve him as a father, and she had to do it in front of an audience of millions. Within hours of Elvis's death being announced, tens of thousands of fans descended on the gates of Graceland. News crews from around the world set up outside. The funeral, held just a few days later, was a massive public event. Reportedly, tens of thousands of people lined the streets of Memphis to watch the procession. Lisa Marie, 9 years old, had to walk through that grief in public, dressed for a funeral that the entire planet was watching, while privately she was still processing what she had seen in that bathroom just days before. Think about the whiplash of that experience. A few days earlier, she'd been a little girl with a dad who woke her up for ice cream runs. Then, in the space of about 72 hours, she went from watching paramedics work on him on a bathroom floor to attending a funeral broadcast around the world to becoming, permanently, for the rest of her life, Elvis Presley's daughter in the eyes of the public. There was no gradual transition. There was no time to simply be a grieving child before she also had to become a symbol, an heir, and eventually a business owner responsible for one of the most valuable estates in entertainment history. Nobody at the time was really equipped to help a child process something like that. This was 1977. The language we now have around childhood trauma, grief counseling, PTSD in children, most of that either didn't exist yet or wasn't widely used outside of specialized clinical settings. Lisa Marie went back to a version of ordinary life: school, her mother's house in California, the normal rhythms of growing up, carrying an experience that most adults never have to face, let alone process it as a child. And for the most part, she didn't talk about it. Not publicly, and by most accounts, not even extensively in private for a very long time. Think about her life after that. Lisa Marie Presley grew up to become a public figure in her own right, a singer-songwriter, someone who spent years navigating fame not because she chased it, but because she was born into it. She married Michael Jackson. She married Nicolas Cage. She had 4 children. She battled addiction publicly and got sober publicly. She lost her only son, Benjamin Keogh, to suicide in 2020. A loss she later said was the hardest thing she ever went through, harder even than losing her father. Through all of that, decades of being one of the most photographed, most gossiped about people in America, The specific details of what she saw and heard on August 16, 1977, stayed almost entirely private. She would occasionally reference the day in general terms. She talked about grief. She talked about how her father's death shaped her relationship with fame, with trust, with the idea that the people you love most can be taken from you without warning. But the granular, physical memory, running down the hallway, being held back, her grandfather's crying, that stayed locked away. Why keep something like that private for almost 50 years? If you've ever lost someone suddenly, especially as a kid, you might already understand the answer. Some memories aren't really stories in the way we think of stories. They're not something you tell at a dinner party or explain in a magazine interview. They're closer to a wound that never fully closes, and every time you touch it, even to explain it to someone else, it opens back up. For a long time, Lisa Marie seemed to have made the choice that most people in her position would make. Protect that memory, protect that room, protect that version of her 9-year-old self, and let the rest of the world have the version of the story that didn't require her to relive the worst moment of her life on command. It's worth bringing in one more voice here, because Lisa Marie wasn't the only Presley carrying pieces of that day. Her mother, Priscilla Presley, has spoken about it too, in her own memoir released decades later, Softly As I Leave You, Life After Elvis. According to Priscilla's account, she was out shopping in California that day when she learned Elvis had been hospitalized. As she scrambled to get to a plane and fly to Memphis, her phone rang. It was Lisa Marie, calling from Graceland in obvious distress, telling her mother that something had happened to her father and that everyone around her was crying. Priscilla has described that call as one of the most gut-wrenching moments of her life, realizing, in real time, from her own 9-year-old daughter's voice, that whatever was happening at Graceland was catastrophic, before she even had official confirmation of what it meant. Priscilla later said she was, in a strange way, thankful that Lisa Marie had been there that day, that despite everything, her daughter got to see her father one last time before he was gone, even if the circumstances were unbearable. It's a complicated kind of gratitude, the sort that only makes sense when you've lived through loss yourself. Relieved that a final goodbye happened at all, even while wishing desperately that it hadn't happened the way it did. Hearing both women's accounts side by side, the mother receiving a terrified phone call from thousands of miles away, and the daughter living through the actual moment inside the house, gives you a fuller picture of just how many people were pulled into the wreckage of that single afternoon, each carrying a different piece of the same unbearable day. So what changed? The full picture of that day didn't really reach the public until Lisa Marie's memoir, From Here to the Great Unknown, was published in October 2024, more than a year and a half after her own sudden death in January 2023 at the age of 54. Here's the part that makes this whole story even more layered. Lisa Marie had been working on the book before she died. She'd recorded audio, written passages, and worked with her daughter Riley Keough on shaping her story. But she passed away from complications related to a small bowel obstruction, with contributing factors linked to an earlier surgery, before the project was finished. Riley took on the responsibility of completing her mother's memoir, using Lisa Marie's own words, recordings, and notes to bring the book across the finish line. Which means that when the world finally read Lisa Marie's account of the day her father died, the feeling that morning, the run to the bathroom, being restrained, her grandfather's crying, they were reading words that Lisa Marie herself had chosen to finally put down, but which reached readers only because her daughter carried the project forward after her death. There's something almost unbearably poignant about that. A woman who spent nearly 50 years protecting the details of the day she lost her father finally decided to share them. And then, before the book could even reach shelves, her own daughter had to finish telling her story, the same way Lisa Marie, as a little girl, had once watched adults around her try to hold together a family that had just lost its center. Riley Keough spoke about this publicly in an interview with Oprah Winfrey in the fall of 2024, as part of a CBS special about the Presley family. In that conversation, Riley described her mother's instinctive sense that something was wrong that morning, confirming, in her own words, what fans had only ever gotten in fragments before. It was one of the first times a member of the family had spoken so directly, on camera, about that specific detail of the day. For fans who had followed the Elvis story for decades, through biographies, documentaries, the Baz Luhrmann film Elvis in 2022, and endless retrospectives, this was new. not the fact that Elvis died on August 16, 1977. Everyone knew that. What was new was the interior experience of it, what it was actually like inside that house, from the perspective of the one person who was closest to him and youngest to witness it. Now, because this is Elvis Presley we're talking about, it's worth pausing to address something directly. There is no shortage of conspiracy theories about his death. Fake Elvis sightings, claims he faked his own death and went into witness protection, theories about what really happened in that bathroom that have circulated in tabloids for decades. We're not here for any of that. The official record has been consistent for a long time. Elvis Presley died of a heart attack, with his personal physician and medical examiners describing it as a cardiac arrhythmia connected to years of health issues, including cardiovascular problems, an enlarged heart, and the long-term effects of chronic prescription drug use. A toxicology analysis at the time reportedly found evidence of multiple prescription medications in his system, though officials also ruled out foul play, suicide, or a single overdose event as the direct cause. Public health experts and biographers since have generally agreed that it was the combined, cumulative toll of long-term substance use and underlying heart disease that killed him. Not one dramatic, single moment, but the slow accumulation of years of strain on a body that had been pushed to its limits. What Lisa Marie's account adds to that story isn't a new theory about how he died. It's not a smoking gun or a secret nobody knew. It's something much more human, a first-hand, eyewitness account of what those final minutes actually looked and felt like from inside the house. The panic, the failed attempts to help him, the sound of a family collapsing in real time. That distinction matters, because it separates this story from the tabloid noise that's followed Elvis for almost 50 years. This isn't about the truth they don't want you to know in some sinister sense. It's about the fact that the emotional truth of that day, the human cost of it, carried by a 9-year-old girl who grew into a woman who spent her whole life in the public eye, simply wasn't told for a very long time, because the person who lived it wasn't ready to tell it. It's genuinely interesting to think about why Elvis's death, specifically, became such fertile ground for conspiracy theories in the first place. Part of it is just the scale of his fame. When someone is that big, that central to the culture, some part of the public psyche resists the idea that he could die the same mundane, human way anyone else might, worn down by years of stress, medication, and an unhealthy lifestyle. It feels almost too ordinary an ending for someone so extraordinary. So the mythology fills in the gaps: fake sightings, secret government programs, elaborate escape plots. None of it holds up against the actual medical and family record, but it persists anyway, because a mystery is more satisfying to some people than a sad, human, and frankly quite common story about a man whose body gave out under the weight of his own fame. Lisa Marie's account cuts straight through all of that noise. It doesn't feed the mythology. If anything, it does the opposite. It grounds the story back in reality, in a specific house on a specific afternoon, with real people trying and failing to save someone they loved. There's no secret twist, just grief made unbearably real by the fact that a child had to witness it firsthand. It's worth sitting with what this actually meant for Lisa Marie's life, because it's easy to treat this as just an interesting historical footnote and move on. It wasn't a footnote for her. It was the defining event of her entire childhood. Losing a parent suddenly, as a child, is one of the most well-documented risk factors for long-term emotional and psychological struggles later in life, and Lisa Marie's adult life bore some of those marks. She spoke openly, later in life, about struggles with addiction, about difficult relationships, about the strange and specific burden of being Elvis's daughter before she ever got the chance to simply be herself. She inherited an empire, Graceland, the estate, the Presley name and everything attached to it, at an age when most people are still trying to figure out who they even are. And she did all of that while, by most accounts, keeping the most painful specifics of her father's death almost entirely to herself. There's a version of this story where you could say, how did she function carrying that? How do you grow up, go to school, fall in love, have children, build a career, all while holding on to the memory of finding your father on a bathroom floor and being physically restrained from reaching him? The honest answer is, not easily. Lisa Marie's life was, by her own accounts and by public record, marked by real struggle, substance abuse issues she battled and eventually got treatment for, relationships that were intensely scrutinized by the public, and a grief that seemed to compound rather than fade, especially after she lost her son Benjamin in 2020. She spoke about that loss in devastating terms, describing it as a pain unlike anything else she had experienced, which, given everything she had already been through, says a great deal. When you look at her life through that lens, the silence around August 16, 1977, starts to make even more sense. It wasn't that she forgot, or that it didn't matter to her. It's that some griefs are so foundational, so early, so tangled up with who you become as a person, that talking about them requires a kind of readiness that can take an entire lifetime to reach, if it ever comes at all. It's also worth acknowledging that Lisa Marie didn't just survive all of this. In many ways, she built a life out of it. She became a genuine recording artist, releasing albums that dealt openly with themes of loss, identity, and fame on her own terms rather than her father's. She got sober publicly at a time when celebrity addiction stories were rarely told with any nuance. She remained deeply connected to Graceland and to the preservation of her father's legacy, taking that responsibility seriously even as a young woman navigating her own very public life. None of that erases the weight of what she carried from 1977 onward, but it does complicate the idea that trauma simply defines a person. Lisa Marie's life was full of genuine joy, creative expression, and love. It just existed alongside a grief that never fully let go, running underneath everything else like a current she'd learned to swim in rather than fight. For Lisa Marie, it seems that readiness to finally tell the full story came near the very end of her own life, as she sat down to put it into words for the first time. From Here to the Great Unknown isn't just a book about Elvis Presley's daughter reflecting on fame. It's Lisa Marie, in her own words, trying to make sense of an entire life shaped by loss, starting with that day in August 1977 and running all the way through losing her son decades later. Critics and readers who went through the book after its release in October 2024 described it as raw in a way celebrity memoirs rarely are: not polished, not carefully managed by a team trying to protect an image, but genuinely unguarded. That makes sense when you consider how it came together. Lisa Marie speaking candidly, on record, likely never imagining that her daughter would be the one finishing her sentences. And that's really the emotional core of this whole story, isn't it? A 9-year-old girl who watched her father die, who spent the rest of her life absorbing the weight of that mourning largely alone, finally found the words to share it, and then didn't live to see those words reach the world. Her daughter, who had grown up hearing fragments of this story the way most of us hear our own family histories, in pieces at the right moments, when someone finally felt ready to talk, became the one to complete it. There's a kind of circularity to that when you think about it. Lisa Marie sensed something was wrong before anyone told her. She lived with that day mostly in silence for nearly 5 decades. And in the end, it was her own daughter who made sure her full story, including that morning, finally reached the people who had spent almost 50 years wondering. Riley Keough has spoken about how emotionally demanding it was to finish her mother's book, reading through her mother's own words about grief, about addiction, about losing a child, all while grieving her mother's own sudden death at the same time. It's hard to imagine a more layered kind of mourning. A daughter finishing her late mother's account of losing her father, written by a woman who had only a few years earlier buried her own son. Grief in the Presley family doesn't seem to travel in a straight line. It loops back on itself, generation after generation, each person inheriting not just fame and fortune, but the emotional weight of everything that came before them. And yet, out of that weight came a book, an act of honesty that Lisa Marie chose to leave behind, even knowing, perhaps, that she might not be there to see how the world received it. So why does any of this matter, almost 50 years after Elvis Presley died? Partly because it reframes one of the most famous deaths in American cultural history, not as a headline, not as a cause of death report, not as a tabloid mystery, but as something that happened inside a family, to real people, including a child who had absolutely no say in any of it. Elvis Presley belongs to history and to millions of fans around the world. But August 16, 1977, also belonged to a 9-year-old girl who just wanted her dad. And partly because Lisa Marie's story is a genuinely important window into how grief actually works, especially childhood grief, especially public grief. We tend to assume that people who experience something traumatic will eventually get over it, or that with enough time the sharp edges wear down. Lisa Marie's life suggests something more honest and more complicated, that some experiences don't fade so much as they change shape, resurfacing at different points across an entire lifetime, showing up in relationships, in struggles with addiction, in the way you parent your own children, in the way you eventually choose or don't choose to talk about the worst day of your life. She carried that morning with her through a marriage to one of the most famous musicians on earth, through her own career, through sobriety and relapse and sobriety again, through the unimaginable loss of her own son. And finally, near the end of her own life, she chose to put it into words, not because anyone forced her to, but because it seems, in the end, she wanted her story told honestly, on her own terms, even if she wouldn't be there to see how it landed. That's not a tabloid secret. That's not a scandal. That's just what it looks like when a person spends an entire lifetime carrying something too heavy to set down easily, and finally finds a way to put it into words before it's too late. There's also something worth taking away from this beyond the Presley family specifically. Almost everyone watching this has some version of a day like August 16th, 1977, somewhere in their own life, not necessarily as dramatic, not played out in front of the entire world, but a moment that quietly reshaped everything that came after it. Lisa Marie's story is a reminder that it's okay if that moment takes years or decades to talk about. It's okay if you protect it for a while, even from the people closest to you. And when you do finally find the words, however long it takes, that act of finally speaking it out loud can be its own kind of healing for you, and often for the people who love you enough to listen. Elvis Presley's death has been picked apart by biographers, documentarians, and tabloid writers for nearly 50 years. But it took his own daughter, writing in her final years, to give the world the piece of the story that mattered most. Not how he died, but what it was like to be the little girl who was there when it happened, and who spent the rest of her life learning how to carry it. So that's the real story of what Lisa Marie Presley saw before Elvis died. Not a conspiracy, not a secret cover-up, but something far more human. A little girl's memory, kept private for nearly 50 years, finally shared in her own words, in a book she wouldn't live to see published. If this story moved you the way it moved me putting it together, let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm always curious which parts of these stories stick with people the most. And if you want more deep dives like this one, real history, real people, told with care instead of clickbait, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there's another one of these coming very soon. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.